The only thing you've ever contributed to this family, my daughter-in-law Charlotte said, her voice carrying with crystalline precision across the polished expanse of their mahogany dining table, is a good example of what not to become. The tines of my fork made a sharp, discordant clatter against the porcelain of my plate. It was the only sound in a sudden cavernous silence. A coldness, distinct and solid as a block of ice, formed instantly behind my sternum. Across from me, my son Michael stared at his own plate, his jaw a tight knot of muscle, his hands flat on the table beside his uneaten roast chicken. He said nothing. He didn't even look at me. There it was, the final severance. I am Eleanor Vance. I am 72 years old, and in that moment I understood that I was utterly alone. But there was something they didn't know about me, something that made the word worthless the most expensive insult she had ever uttered. If they only knew what they had just thrown away. To understand the weight of that silence and the price of that word, you have to understand the life I had lived, the secrets I had kept, and the man with whom I had built an empire disguised as a quiet life. To understand why, you need to know who I really am. It begins, as most things do, with love and with want. I was not born to the quiet, modest life my son and his wife saw. I was born to noise and to lack. My father worked the docks in a city that had long forgotten how to be kind, and my mother took in sewing, her fingers perpetually pricked and stained. I grew up with the smell of coal dust in the air, and the gnawing understanding that our lives were measured by what we did not have. There was a constant, low-grade humiliation in it. The way the grocer's wife would look at my mother's mended coat, the way my teachers would praise my grades with a tone of surprise, as if intelligence were a luxury we couldn't afford. I promised myself I would never feel that specific kind of shame again. Not the shame of poverty itself, but the shame of being seen as less than because of it. I met Robert Vance in a university library. I was on a scholarship, a detail I guarded fiercely, studying economics with a ferocity that left little time for anything else. He was studying architecture, but he spent most of his time sketching on any available surface, lost in a world of line and form. He had this habit even then of sketching on cocktail napkins. He'd be at a pub with friends, a formal university dinner, anywhere, and out would come a pen. The ink would bleed into the flimsy, absorbent paper, blurring the sharp angles he envisioned, and he'd let out a soft sound of frustration, a little tisk under his breath. But he couldn't stop. He always smelled faintly of graphite, and the crisp, dry scent of old paper from the library stacks. He was brilliant, a true artist. He saw the skeletons of beautiful buildings in derelict warehouses, and the promise of light in cramped, dark city lots. What he could not see was a balance sheet. Numbers, to Robert, were abstract annoyances. Contracts were tedious formalities. He wanted to build. He did not want to run a business. I saw that in him from the beginning, and I loved him for it. I loved his unruly mind, his passion, his complete disregard for the practicalities that had ruled my entire existence. We married a year after graduation, in a small civil ceremony with 2 friends as witnesses. We had nothing. Our first apartment was a cramped 2-room walk-up that smelled of boiled cabbage from the flat below. We had a mattress on the floor, a card table for a desk, and a shared dream. He would design the most beautiful buildings the city had ever seen. I would make sure he could afford to. That was the silent pact we made. He never had to ask. I simply began. While he drew, I read books on contract law. While he built models out of balsa wood and glue, I taught myself accounting. The Vance Architectural Group was incorporated with $100 I had saved from a waitressing job. The official papers listed Robert as president and sole proprietor. My name was nowhere on them. It was his dream, his talent. I was happy to be the scaffolding, the unseen structure that allowed his vision to reach for the sky. He was the face. I was the mind behind it. He called me the foundation. It was his highest compliment. Anyone can see the spire, Ellie, he said, tracing the lines of a blueprint with a calloused finger. But you're the foundation. You're the part no one ever sees, the part buried in the dark. But without you, the whole thing comes crashing down. He had chalk dust permanently embedded in the deep cuffs of his work shirts, a fine white powder that never quite washed out, a ghost of the buildings he was bringing to life. He called investing his hobby, the way other men might call fishing theirs. But it wasn't his hobby, it was mine. I took the small profits from our first few projects, a garage conversion, a kitchen remodel, and I didn't put them in a savings account. I put them into the stock of a small, obscure technology company a professor had mentioned in one of my old economics textbooks. Robert just smiled and let me. He trusted me completely. The business grew. Slowly at first, then all at once. Robert's design for the new city library, a soaring structure of glass and reclaimed steel, won a major award. Suddenly, the phone didn't stop ringing. The contracts became larger, the numbers more dizzying. I signed our first $1 million contract in a sweltering conference room where the air conditioning was broken. I wore my only good blouse, a silk one with a tiny coffee stain I'd tried to hide under the lapel. I remember the feel of the pen in my hand, the weight of that number, and the quiet, fierce satisfaction. Robert was celebrated in magazines. He gave interviews. He stood on stages and accepted awards. I stood at the back of the room watching. It was enough. Seeing his dream realized, knowing I had been the one to pour the concrete and balance the load, that was my reward. We never lived extravagantly. We bought a comfortable, solid house in a quiet, tree-lined suburb, the same house I lived in until Michael sold it. We drove sensible cars. Our one indulgence was books and travel. We raised Michael in that house, a house filled with love and the smell of roasting chicken on Sundays. I remember one afternoon, he must have been 6. He was sitting on the floor of Robert's home office, surrounded by blueprints. He picked up a red pencil and drew a wobbly, 6-legged dog in the margin of a plan for a new skyscraper. I saw it, and my breath caught, waiting for Robert to be angry. But Robert just knelt, looked at the drawing seriously, and said, "Well, we'll have to add a dog run to the rooftop garden, won't we?" He taped the drawing to the wall. Michael glowed with a pride so pure it was almost painful to watch. That was the father Robert was. That was the family we were. Then came Charlotte. Michael met her in his last year of university. He brought her home for Sunday dinner. She walked into our home, a home that smelled of cedar from the closet and the books that lined every wall. And the first thing I smelled from her was money. It was a specific perfume, sharp and floral and expensive, a scent designed to announce itself. She took in our comfortable, slightly worn furniture, the stacks of magazines on the coffee table, the faded oriental rug in the hall. "Your home is so cozy," she said. It was the first of her unique condescensions, a word wrapped in silk to hide its sharp edges. Cozy meant small. It meant old-fashioned. It meant not enough. She came from a different world, she explained, not a world of wealth, but a world that worshipped it from the outside. Her mother had been a seamstress for the city's elite, and Charlotte had grown up watching her mother be treated as little more than a servant. She'd wait in the back entrances of grand houses while her mother penned hymns, listening to the casual cruelty of women who would complain about the cost of a gown while her mother worried about the gas bill. I understood her hunger. I understood her fear of returning to that world of shame. What I didn't understand was the coldness she used as a shield, a coldness that saw kindness as a weakness and modesty as failure. She performed wealth because she had been mocked for not having it, and she could not distinguish between the quiet confidence of people who have enough and the quiet desperation of people who do not. She began her campaign to improve us, subtly at first. She'd bring expensive bottles of wine to dinner, talking about the vineyard and the specific notes of dark cherry and leather, a clear performance for Robert and me, who were perfectly happy with a $10 bottle of red. She would look at my simple sheath dress, one I'd owned for years and felt comfortable in, and say, "Oh, Eleanor, you are so wonderfully unconcerned with fashion. It's truly refreshing." Refreshing meant dowdy. Michael, my sweet, gentle Michael, was enchanted. He saw her ambition as drive, her materialism as good taste. He had grown up sheltered by the quiet wealth I had built, never wanting for anything, and so he had no concept of its true cost. For him, money was an abstract resource that was simply there. Charlotte saw it as the entire point of the game. The financial ledger began with their wedding. Charlotte wanted a fairy tale, a downtown cathedral, a reception at the city's most exclusive hotel, a shimmering backless gown of silver sequins that cost more than my car. Michael came to us, shuffling his feet, unable to meet my eye. "It's a lot, Mom, but it's what she wants. It's her one day." Robert and I had a portfolio we called our Trip Around the World Fund. For 20 years we had put money into it, dreaming of seeing the pyramids, of walking the Great Wall, of drinking wine in a tiny Italian village. It held, at that time, just over $150,000. "Use that," I told Robert later that night, my voice quiet. He looked at me, his face etched with concern. "Ellie, that's our dream. Our son is starting his life," I said. "That's a new dream." I wrote the check for $150,000. It felt like tearing a map in half. I handed it to Michael. He hugged me, his relief palpable. Charlotte didn't thank me directly. She just told her friends, loud enough for me to hear at the engagement party, that her parents were contributing the sentimental things and Michael's parents were handling the financials. I was reduced to a bank. Next was the house. They wanted to live in the city's most fashionable neighborhood, in a new glass and steel condominium with a dormer and a rooftop pool. The down payment was astronomical. It was $300,000. That was the entirety of our emergency fund. It was 40 years of Robert's bonuses, every extra penny that I had meticulously invested and reinvested. My what if fund? What if the roof leaks? What if one of us gets sick? What if the market crashes? I had built that fund as a fortress around our lives. Michael came to me again. "We can't get a mortgage without it, Mom. It's the only way. Charlotte says it's an investment." I looked at my son, at the worry in his eyes, a worry placed there by his wife's relentless desire. And I said yes. I liquidated the portfolio. The fortress came down. The check cleared. They moved in. Charlotte sent me a photograph of herself sipping champagne on their new balcony, the city lights twinkling behind her. The caption read, "Home, sweet home." There was no mention of the sacrifice that had purchased it. Then Robert got sick. It was fast and it was brutal. A cancer that came out of nowhere and consumed him in 6 months. The last few weeks were a blur of hospital rooms that smelled of antiseptic and fear. He was lucid only in short bursts. In one of them, he grabbed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "The key, Ellie," he whispered, his voice a dry rustle. "The key to the filing cabinet in my desk, the bottom drawer. I know, Robert, it's safe. Everything is in there. For you, the foundation," he breathed out. "Don't let them see the plans." I didn't know exactly what he meant. I thought he was delirious. He slipped away a few days later, holding my hand. The chalk dust was gone from his shirts, washed away by the hospital laundry, and the world felt silent and gray. After he died, the trickle of requests from Michael and Charlotte became a flood. Michael had an idea for a tech startup. It was a vague, ill-conceived plan to create a social media platform for curated travel experiences. Charlotte was convinced it would make them millions. It needed seed money, $85,000. It was the last of the bonds I had inherited from my own mother, the final remnant of my own family's meager legacy. I sold them. The startup failed in less than a year. Then came the monthly stipend. Charlotte quit her job in marketing to become a consultant and brand ambassador, which seemed to involve having expensive lunches and posting photos of them on the internet. Their lifestyle outstripped Michael's salary. We're just a little short each month, Michael explained over the phone, his voice strained. Just until I get my next venture off the ground. 5,000 a month, just to tide us over. I agreed. I set up an automatic transfer from the dividend account of a stock portfolio I managed myself. The same one I'd started with that $100 from my waitressing job decades ago. They didn't know about the portfolio. They just knew the money appeared in their account on the first of every month. The grand total, not including the monthly stipend that had been running for 3 years, was $535,000, a number that felt like a physical weight in my chest. And in return, I received Sunday dinners. Dinners where Charlotte would detail their latest purchase, a trip to Bali, a new car, a piece of art, while subtly critiquing my life. She convinced Michael to sell my house, the house I had shared with Robert for 40 years, the house where Michael had drawn a six-legged dog on a blueprint. It's too much for you to manage, Mom, he said, the words clearly fed to him by Charlotte. All that space, the upkeep. We found you a lovely little apartment, much more practical. Lovely meant small. Practical meant cheap. They sold the house for a fortune, a price inflated by the booming market. They told me the money was being put into a trust for me, for my care. I knew somehow that I would never see a penny of it. They moved me into a small one-bedroom apartment in a building full of other widows. It smelled of dust and wilting flowers. My beautiful solid furniture from the old house wouldn't fit, so it was sold. They bought me new things, lightweight, particle board, furniture that felt temporary and cheap. My life was being systematically dismantled, replaced with a smaller, more manageable version of itself. And that brings us back to the mahogany dining table. Sunday dinner. A ritual I had come to dread. I was sitting in their opulent dining room, the city lights a glittering tapestry beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Charlotte was wearing a black dress that was deceptively simple. I knew from the way she held herself it had cost a fortune. She was talking about a charity gala she was chairing. It's for the children's hospital, she said, swirling a deep red wine in her glass. We're hoping to raise $500,000. The Vance family will be making a significant contribution, of course. It's about legacy. She looked at me then, her eyes cool and appraising. She had just asked me to co-sign a loan for yet another of Michael's business ideas, and I, for the first time, had hesitated. I hadn't said no. I had just said, I need to think about it. That small act of resistance was, in her eyes, a declaration of war. Legacy, she repeated, her voice turning sharp. It's about what you build, what you contribute, not what you take up. She paused, letting the silence stretch. Michael shifted in his chair, his gaze fixed on the floral centerpiece. He was a spectator at the slow execution of his own mother, and then she said it, the line that changed everything. The only thing you've ever contributed to this family, she said, looking right at me, her face a mask of polite contempt, is a good example of what not to become. Worthless. The word hung in the air, invisible and heavy. My fork clattered. The sound was like a crack in the foundation of my world. I looked at Michael, my son, the boy whose childhood drawings his father had treasured, and in his averted eyes I saw my answer. He agreed, or at least he would not disagree. I pushed my chair back slowly. The legs scraped against the polished floor. Thank you for dinner, I said, my voice a stranger's thin and brittle. I think I should be going. Neither of them tried to stop me. I walked out of their apartment, my canvas tote with a faded museum logo, from a trip Robert and I took the year Michael was born, feeling flimsy and pathetic in my hand. In the elevator, I looked at my reflection in the polished brass walls. An old woman in a simple gray dress, her face pale, her eyes wide with a pain so deep it had not yet found a name. But as the elevator descended, something else began to rise in me. Not anger, not yet. It was a cold, hard clarity. The grief was a physical thing, a stone behind my sternum, but beneath it something else was stirring, a purpose. Robert's last words, don't let them see the plans. When I got back to my small, impersonal apartment, I didn't turn on the lights. I walked to the small desk they had bought me. In the bottom drawer, where I kept my checkbook and a few old photographs, was a small, heavy brass key. It was for the one piece of furniture I had refused to sell, Robert's old filing cabinet. It was a heavy, ugly steel thing, but it was his. They had relegated it to my storage locker in the basement of the building. I took the elevator down to the basement. The air was cool and smelled of damp concrete and dust. I unlocked the locker, the sound of the metal bolt sliding back echoing in the stillness. There it was. Pushed into a corner behind a set of tires Michael was storing for his sports car. I pulled it open. The drawer slid with a well-oiled smoothness. The bottom drawer was locked. I inserted the brass key. It turned with a satisfying solid click. Inside was not what I expected. Not old blueprints or sentimental letters. It was a series of leather-bound portfolios, a dozen of them, each labeled with a year. And on top a single thick envelope with my name, Eleanor, written in Robert's familiar architectural script. My fingers trembled as I lifted the flap. It was not a letter. It was a document, a legal document drafted by our longtime lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, and signed by Robert the year before he died. It was a transfer of ownership. It stated that upon his death, 100% of the shares in a holding company I had never heard of, the Bedrock Holdings Group, were to be transferred solely to me. I sat there on the cold concrete floor of the storage locker and read the attached asset list. Bedrock Holdings Group was the sole owner of the Vance Architectural Group. It owned the office building downtown where the firm was housed. It owned the patents on 3 of Robert's innovative building techniques. It owned a stock portfolio so vast it made my personal one look like a child's piggy bank. The firm hadn't been sold. It hadn't been dissolved. Robert hadn't left it to Michael. He had left it to me. I had been running it all along from the shadows, but he had made sure that in the end, the shadows themselves would belong to me. I flipped to the last page of the portfolio summary. A net worth statement, updated quarterly by Mr. Abernathy's office. I ran my finger down the column of figures, my mind struggling to process the zeros. The total net worth of the entity I now controlled was $542 million. I realized I had stopped breathing. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I put a hand against the cold steel of the cabinet to steady myself. $542 million. And my son and his wife, who were living off my dividends, thought I was worthless. A sound escaped my lips. It wasn't a sob. It was a laugh, a dry, humorless, brittle sound that echoed in the concrete tomb of my discarded life. The foundation. Something inside me shifted then. The cold stone of grief behind my sternum didn't melt. It hardened. It turned from grief into granite. I closed the file, locked the cabinet, and walked out of the storage locker, leaving the old Eleanor Vance behind. The new one had work to do. The next morning I called Mr. Abernathy. His voice was the same as it had always been, calm, measured, a voice that had been delivering bad news and good news with the same steady cadence for 50 years. "Eleanor," he said, a genuine warmth in his tone, "it's good to hear from you. I was sorry to hear about the house. I know how much you and Robert loved that place." "The house is just a house, Howard," I said. And my own voice surprised me. It was different. It was no longer the voice of a woman asking permission to exist. It was clear and firm. "I need to see you. I have the key." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a short, sharp intake of breath. "I see," he said. "Of course. My office. 1 o'clock." Mr. Abernathy's office was on the 40th floor of a downtown skyscraper, a building Robert had designed 20 years ago. The reception area smelled of rich leather, fresh coffee, and something else, the clean, crisp scent of power. I sat in a plush armchair, my canvas tote on the floor beside me. I was wearing the same charcoal gray dress from the night before. I hadn't slept. Howard greeted me himself, foregoing the secretary. He was a tall, stooped man in his late 70s, with kind eyes behind thick glasses. He led me into his office. a corner room with a panoramic view of the city. He closed the door, the click of the latch sounding loud in the quiet room. Robert once told me, he began, sitting behind his enormous desk, if Eleanor ever comes to you with that key, you do whatever she asks. No questions. He folded his hands on the blotter. So, Eleanor, what do you want to do? I placed the leather-bound portfolio on his desk. First, I said, I want you to explain this to me. All of it. For the next 2 hours, he walked me through it. The holding company was a structure he and Robert had set up 15 years ago, a way to protect the firm's assets and ensure a smooth succession. Robert, it turned out, knew his own health was fragile long before the cancer appeared. He knew Michael had no head for the business, and he feared that Charlotte's ambition would dismantle everything they had built. He wanted you to have the choice, Eleanor, Howard explained, his voice gentle. He set up a small pension for you, the one you've been living on, drawn from a separate account. It was a decoy. He knew you'd never touch the real money unless you were forced to. He created a scenario where you could continue to live your quiet life and the firm would be managed by the board he appointed. Or you could take control. He appointed a board? Yes, a very competent one. They've been managing the firm since his death. Profits have increased 12% year over year. The Vance Group is stronger than ever. They report to the owner of Bedrock Holdings. They report to you. They just don't know it yet. As far as they know, they're reporting to a blind trust managed by my office. A new kind of trembling started in my hands, not from fear, but from the sheer scale of it. I, Eleanor Vance, the woman who was a good example of what not to become, was the chairman of the board of one of the most successful architectural firms in the country. Howard, I said, my voice barely a whisper, the monthly payments to my son, the money from the sale of my house, where did that come from? He looked down at his papers, his expression pained. Michael and Charlotte petitioned my office as the trustees of what they thought was your estate after Robert's death. They produced documents signed by you, giving them power of attorney. They used it to sell the house. The proceeds, nearly $2 million, were transferred to an account under Michael's name. As for the monthly stipend, they told you it was from me, from the trust. It wasn't. You were paying them yourself, Eleanor, from your own dividend portfolio. You've been funding their entire lifestyle out of your personal savings. The deception was so complete, so breathtakingly audacious, it almost commanded respect. They had built a cage for me using my own money, my own love as the bars. Howard leaned forward, his professional composure cracking for just a moment. He looked at me, his eyes full of a deep, sorrowful respect. My wife, Martha, she passed away 10 years ago. She was a biochemist, published dozens of papers, but her male colleagues, they always got the credit. She won a huge grant for the university, and in the press release, they called her a valuable member of the team. She was the whole team. He shook his head slightly. Robert knew what you were, Eleanor. He knew you were the foundation. He made sure you would have the last word. A single tear, hot and sharp, slid down my cheek. It was not from sadness. It was from a profound, aching gratitude for the man who had seen me, truly seen me, even when I was determined to remain invisible. All right, Howard, I said, wiping the tear away with the back of my hand. My voice was steady again. Here is what we are going to do. The next few weeks were a blur of methodical preparation. It was like planning one of Robert's buildings, piece by piece, ensuring every joint was sound, every measurement precise. First, under Howard's guidance, I opened a new set of bank accounts in my name only. We initiated the transfer of all liquid assets from Bedrock Holdings into these new accounts. We established a new formal trust, the Vance Foundation, with a very specific charter focused on funding scholarships for women in architecture and business. I was the sole director. Next, I called my bank and canceled the $5,000 automatic monthly transfer to Michael's account. Then I canceled the supplementary credit card Charlotte used, the one linked to my personal account, the one she believed was a corporate card from Michael's consulting work. Then came the locks. I called a locksmith to come to my apartment. He was a young man with tattooed arms and a kind smile. As he worked on my door, fitting a new heavy-duty deadbolt, he said, "Changing the locks is a powerful thing. It's not about who you're keeping out. It's about deciding who you let in. You're the one holding the key now." His simple wisdom resonated deep within me. I was finally holding the key. The first sign that the ripples were reaching shore came a week later. My phone rang. It was Michael. "Mom," he said, his voice tight with an unfamiliar anxiety. "Hey, weird question. Did you change your bank or something? The monthly transfer, it didn't come through." "No, Michael," I said calmly. "I didn't change my bank." "Oh, okay. Must be a glitch then. I'll call them." He sounded relieved. Anyway, Charlotte was asking. Her platinum card got declined today at Cartier. It was so embarrassing for her. "You haven't heard of any issues with the accounts, have you?" "No, Michael," I said again, my voice even. "I haven't heard of any issues." There was a pause. I could hear his shallow breathing. He was starting to suspect, but his mind couldn't make the leap. To him, I was a fixed point of maternal support, as reliable and unthinking as the sun rising. The idea that I could act was outside his realm of possibility. "Okay, well, talk to you Sunday?" he asked, his voice trailing off. "I won't be there, Michael," I said. "I have other plans." And I hung up the phone. It was the first time in my life I had ever hung up on my son. It felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and liberating all at once. For the first time in years, I did something for myself. I walked to a small florist shop near my apartment and bought a single perfect white orchid. It was delicate and strong, a flower that required patience and care. I placed it on my windowsill where it could catch the morning light. It was a small act, but it felt monumental. It was mine. The next escalation came 2 days later. It was an email forwarded to me from Howard. It was from a law firm I didn't recognize, addressed to the trustees of the Eleanor Vance estate. It was a formal inquiry, full of legal jargon, but its meaning was clear. It was the first step in a process to have me declared mentally incompetent. It cited my erratic behavior, hesitating on the loan, my inability to manage my affairs, the house sale they had engineered, and my advancing age. They were going to have me committed. They were going to take everything and use the law to do it. I stared at the email, the black words on the white screen. This was not just about money anymore. This was about my freedom, my very existence. They were trying to erase me. I picked up the phone and called Howard. "They've started the proceedings," I said. There was no tremor in my voice. There was only ice. "I've already responded, Eleanor," he said, his voice a low growl of controlled anger. "I informed them that their client, Mr. Michael Vance, has no legal standing, that you are perfectly competent, and that any further attempts to harass you will be met with the full force of my firm's resources. I also attached a preliminary accounting of the funds you have gifted them over the past 5 years. I suspect we won't be hearing from them again." And we didn't. The legal threat vanished as quickly as it had appeared. In its place came a different kind of assault, a social one. The invitation arrived the next day by courier. It was thick, cream-colored cardstock with embossed silver lettering. It was for the Starlight Gala for the Children's Hospital, the event Charlotte was chairing. A personal, handwritten note was tucked inside. "Eleanor," it read, in Charlotte's perfect, looping script. "I know things have been tense, but this night is so important. It's about family and legacy. Please come. It would mean the world to us to have you there. It was a trap, a public performance. She would parade me around, the dotty old mother, a prop in her grand play of philanthropy and family values. She would use my presence to legitimize herself in front of the audience she cared about most, the wealthy, powerful patrons of her new social circle." I looked at the invitation, and I smiled. "Howard," I said when I got him on the phone, "I need a ticket to the Starlight Gala, and I need you to arrange a meeting for me with the board of the Vance Group the morning after the gala." "Consider it done," he said. The night of the gala, I stood before the small mirror in my bedroom. I had laid out my clothes carefully. Not a new dress, not something expensive to compete with Charlotte. I chose the charcoal gray sheath dress I'd owned for 15 years. It was beautifully made, timeless, and it fit me perfectly. It was the dress of a woman who knew who she was, who had nothing to prove. My only jewelry was a simple strand of pearls Robert had given me on our 20th anniversary. I looked at my reflection, the face of a 72-year-old woman. There were lines around my eyes and mouth, a map of a life lived, but my eyes were clear. For a moment, a wave of profound grief washed over me. I sat on the edge of my bed, the silky fabric of the dress cool against my skin. I picked up a small silver-framed photograph from my nightstand. It was of Michael, aged 5, at the beach. He was laughing, his hair wet with sea spray, a gap where his 2 front teeth should be. He was holding my hand, his small fingers wrapped tightly around mine. My son, my beautiful boy. Was I doing the right thing? To dismantle his life, to humiliate his wife publicly? The pain of what I was about to do was a physical ache in my chest. I was a mother. My entire being was wired to protect him, to cushion his falls. And I was about to push him off a cliff. I almost picked up the phone. I could call, make an excuse, let them have the money, let them have their lives, built on my silent sacrifice. What did it matter in the end? I was old. I didn't need a fortune. Then my gaze fell on the invitation lying on my dresser. The elegant silver script. It's about family and legacy. I remembered Charlotte's cool, dismissive eyes. I remembered the word worthless, and I remembered Robert's voice, a dry whisper in a sterile hospital room. Don't let them see the plans. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. It was about honoring the man who had seen me and the woman he had seen. It was about reclaiming the foundation. My resolve hardened, no longer granite, but diamond. I stood up, put the photograph back on the nightstand, picked up my old canvas tote, and walked out the door. The ballroom of the hotel was a galaxy of shimmering lights and expensive perfume. The air itself smelled of money, a cloying mix of designer fragrances, champagne, and ambition. Hundreds of people in tuxedos and gowns drifted through the cavernous space, their laughter echoing off the frescoed ceiling. Waiters carrying trays of glittering glasses moved silently through the crowd. This was Charlotte's world, a stage she had built for herself on my foundation. I handed my simple cloth coat to a surprised-looking attendant and walked in. I felt, for a moment, like a ghost, an anomaly in my simple gray dress and my worn-out tote bag. People's eyes slid over me, dismissing me in a fraction of a second. I was invisible. It was a familiar feeling, but for the first time, it felt like a superpower. I saw them across the room holding court near the grand staircase. Michael was in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, looking handsome but strained, a fixed smile on his face. Charlotte was breathtaking. She wore a shimmering backless gown of silver sequins that clung to her like a second skin. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears. She was incandescent, a star in her own firmament, and she was radiating triumph. She saw me, and her smile faltered for a bare second before becoming wider, more brittle. She glided towards me, Michael trailing in her wake. "Eleanor, you came," she gushed, kissing the air beside my cheek. "I'm so glad. You look comfortable." She gestured vaguely at my dress. Her eyes flickered down to my canvas tote bag. "Let me have someone put that somewhere for you." "No, thank you, Charlotte," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I'll keep it with me." She tried to steer me towards a small table in the far back corner of the room near the kitchens. "We saved a spot for you over here, where it's a little quieter," she said, her hand on my arm a little too tight. "Thank you, but I'd prefer to stand," I said, gently removing her hand. "I want to be able to see the stage." Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. This was not part of her script. I was supposed to be the meek, grateful mother, tucked away out of sight. I found a spot near a large pillar, a good vantage point with a clear view of the lectern, and I waited. After an hour of mingling and air kissing, the lights dimmed. A man I didn't recognize, the hospital president, went to the stage and spoke for a few minutes. Then he introduced the chair of the gala, the woman whose tireless work had made this all possible, Charlotte Vance. The applause was thunderous. Charlotte walked to the stage, a vision in silver, and stood at the lectern. She beamed at the crowd, at her friends, at the city's elite. This was her coronation. "Thank you," she said, her voice smooth and practiced. "Thank you all for being here tonight to support such a worthy cause. When they asked me to chair this event, I knew I had to say yes, because the values of this hospital, caring, community, building a better future, are the values of my own family." She paused, her eyes finding Michael in the crowd. He looked up at her, his face a mixture of adoration and anxiety. "Legacy," she continued, her voice resonating with false emotion. "It's a word we hear a lot, but what does it mean? It isn't about what you have, it's about what you build. It's about the foundations you lay for the future. My husband's family, the Vances, have always understood this. They built a legacy not just of beautiful buildings, but of quiet, steadfast generosity, a legacy I am so proud to carry on." I could feel the eyes of the people around me, their rapt attention. They were buying every word. "And so," she said, her voice swelling, "in honor of that legacy and to kick off our fundraising tonight, my husband and I, on behalf of the Vance Family Foundation, would like to pledge $100,000. A gasp went through the crowd, followed by a wave of enthusiastic applause. Charlotte held up a hand, basking in the glow. Michael looked stunned. He clearly had not been consulted on this. $100,000, a number she had no way of funding. "Our finance chair will be around to take your pledges," Charlotte said, smiling. "But to show we're serious, I'd like to make the first payment right now." A woman with a clipboard and a portable credit card machine made her way to the stage. Charlotte reached into her tiny glittering handbag and pulled out her platinum credit card. "My credit card." She handed it to the woman with a flourish. The woman swiped it, and again. She looked at the small screen, a frown creasing her forehead. She swiped it a third time. The silence in the room began to stretch, becoming taut and uncomfortable. "I'm sorry," the woman said, her voice a stage whisper that seemed to carry to every corner of the room. "It's declined." Charlotte's face, which had been flushed with triumph, went bone white. The color drained from her cheeks as if a plug had been pulled. "What? That's impossible. Run it again." The woman shook her head. "I'm sorry, the issuing bank has canceled the card." Declined. The word hung in the air, a perfect, brutal counterpoint to Charlotte's grand speech. The silence that followed was absolute. It was thick, heavy, and deafening. Every eye in the room was on Charlotte, on her frozen, horrified face. This was the moment. I stepped out from behind the pillar. I walked slowly, deliberately towards the stage. My simple dress, my canvas tote, they were no longer signs of poverty, but of a different kind of power. The crowd parted for me, a sea of sequins and silk. I walked up the small set of stairs and stood beside my daughter-in-law at the lectern. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fury and panic. "What are you doing?" she hissed. I didn't answer her. I turned to the microphone. My voice, when I spoke, was not loud, but it was perfectly clear, and it carried through the silent room. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," I said. I looked directly at Charlotte. "Charlotte, you spoke so eloquently about legacy and about the Vance family's contributions. I was hoping you could clarify something for the audience. What exactly was my contribution to this legacy you speak of?" She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently. She was speechless. "Let me help you," I continued, my voice still calm, still quiet. "Was it the $150,000 for your wedding, the money my husband and I had saved for 20 years to travel the world?" A murmur went through the crowd. Or perhaps, I went on, it was the $300,000 for the down payment on your condominium, our entire life savings. The murmur grew louder. Michael, in the crowd, looked like he was going to be sick. His face was ashen. Or was it the $85,000 for your husband's failed business venture, the money I inherited from my own mother? I paused. Or the $5,000 a month, every month, for the past 3 years, that I have paid you out of my own pocket just so you could have lunches like this? I let the numbers hang in the air. I reached into my canvas tote bag. I didn't pull out bank statements or legal documents. I pulled out a single, elegant, cream-colored business card. You see, you're right about one thing, Charlotte, I said, my voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in. Legacy is about what you build. I placed the business card on the wooden lectern. It made a soft, definitive sound, a solid, final sound. I was the co-founder of the Vance Architectural Group, I said. And as of my husband's death, I am its sole owner and chairman of the board. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. It was absolute. It pressed in on my ears. It had physical weight and texture. Charlotte's face had crumpled. It was no longer a mask of contempt, but a ruin of disbelief. Her hands, which had been gripping the lectern, were trembling violently. I leaned into the microphone one last time. I looked at Charlotte, at the wreckage of her arrogance. You were right about one thing, Charlotte, I said, my voice soft. Legacy is about what you give, and I have given you enough. Then I turned and walked away. I did not look back at her. I did not look at Michael. I walked down the steps through the stunned, silent crowd and out of the ballroom. The silence followed me all the way to the door. As I pushed it open, I heard the first shocked whispers erupt behind me, the sound of a carefully constructed world shattering into a million pieces. The cool night air hit my face like a blessing. It smelled of rain and exhaust fumes, the real smells of a real city, and I took a deep, shuddering breath. The stone behind my sternum, the